In the year 1850, Berlin was expanding at a speed that left little room for human adjustment, and the most unsettling truth was that the city's growth was no longer serving the people who built it. Factories rose almost overnight, drawing thousands from the countryside with promises of work, yet what awaited them was a city unprepared for their arrival. Streets filled faster than homes could be built, wages lagged behind rising prices, and survival became a daily calculation rather than a given condition. What makes this moment disturbing is that Berlin was celebrated as a symbol of progress, while ordinary people quietly endured exhaustion, illness, and overcrowding on a scale few had experienced before. The city did not pause to adapt, and those who could not keep up were simply absorbed into its pressure, their struggles unnoticed amid the noise of expansion. For the working population, daily life became a test of endurance shaped by long hours and fragile living conditions. Families were crammed into single rooms, often sharing walls with strangers, while poor sanitation allowed disease to spread quickly through entire neighborhoods. Children entered factories early, not because it was ideal, but because survival demanded every possible income. The pace of industrial life stripped away rest and stability, replacing them with routines built around exhaustion rather than health. Berlin's growth depended on this labor, yet offered little protection in return, creating a cycle where progress fed on human limits. Illness and injury were common, and recovery was a luxury few could afford, reinforcing the sense that the city moved forward regardless of who fell behind. Despite these pressures, Berlin continued to expand, driven by ambition that outweighed caution. People adapted where they could, forming communities within hardship and relying on shared resilience rather than institutional support. Yet the cost of this adaptation was visible in shortened lives and constant strain, revealing that the city's success rested on fragile foundations. Berlin in 1850 was not collapsing, but it was consuming its people faster than they could recover, proving that unchecked growth carries consequences hidden beneath achievement. The city stood as a warning that progress without balance does not simply reshape landscapes, it reshapes human endurance itself, pushing individuals beyond what they were meant to survive. As Berlin's population surged, the strain on its social fabric became increasingly visible, even if rarely acknowledged by those benefiting from expansion. Entire districts transformed into dense clusters of laborers whose lives revolved around factory whistles rather than daylight, compressing time as tightly as space. Leisure nearly vanished, replaced by exhaustion that blurred days together and left little energy for reflection or resistance. Food was often inadequate, housing unstable, and medical care inaccessible, creating conditions where survival depended more on luck than effort. The city's rapid growth rewarded speed and output, not well-being, and those who faltered were quickly replaced by newcomers arriving with the same fragile hopes. Berlin's streets bustled with activity, yet beneath that movement lay a population constantly pushed to its limits. Over time, the human cost of this growth began to shape awareness, even if solutions remained distant. Small acts of solidarity emerged, neighbors sharing resources, workers forming informal networks, and families relying on one another when institutions failed. These responses did not solve the underlying problem, but they offered brief relief in a city that demanded more than it returned. Berlin in 1850 revealed a critical truth about industrial expansion, that progress measured only in output ignores the capacity of human bodies and minds. The city did not slow, and its people learned to endure rather than thrive, carrying the weight of growth that moved faster than they could adapt. As the years passed, Berlin's relentless expansion began to shape how people understood their own worth, tying survival directly to productivity. A person's value was increasingly measured by their ability to work long hours without complaint, and those who could not meet these expectations were quietly pushed aside.
Injury, illness, or age often meant sudden poverty because support systems were limited and recovery time was a luxury most could not afford. This constant pressure eroded stability, forcing families to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition. The city's pace left little room for grief or rest, as daily life demanded continuous output to keep up with rising costs and competition. Berlin did not simply grow outward, it pressed inward, narrowing the space in which ordinary people could live without breaking. Yet, even within these harsh conditions, the human instinct to adapt persisted. Workers developed routines to conserve energy, communities organized around shared hardship, and people found small moments of meaning within lives dominated by labor. These adaptations did not erase suffering, but they allowed survival in an environment that offered few alternatives. Berlin in 1850 became a place where endurance replaced comfort as the primary measure of success, and resilience was learned through necessity rather than choice. The city's growth told a story of achievement and modernity, but beneath it lay countless lives stretched beyond their limits, reminding history that progress, when left unchecked, can demand more from humanity than it can safely give. As Berlin continued its transformation, the gap between the city's outward success and the inner lives of its people grew wider and harder to ignore. Public buildings, railways, and factories stood as symbols of strength and ambition, yet they were supported by a population increasingly worn down by the demands placed upon it. The city offered opportunity, but it demanded constant sacrifice in return, leaving little space for recovery or reflection. Many residents lived with the quiet fear that a single misstep could undo everything, because there was no safety net beneath the momentum of progress. This awareness shaped behavior, encouraging compliance over protest and endurance over hope, as survival depended on staying useful in a system that never slowed. Berlin's growth created pride and exhaustion in equal measure, binding people to a future they had little control over. By the middle of the century, it became clear that Berlin's rapid expansion was reshaping not just its streets, but its humanity. The city had learned how to grow efficiently, but not how to protect those who made that growth possible. Ordinary people carried the cost in their bodies and minds, absorbing pressure that institutions were unwilling or unable to relieve. Berlin in 1850 stood at a turning point, a city powerful in appearance, yet fragile in foundation, sustained by endurance rather than balance. History often remembers its rise as inevitable, but living within it felt anything but certain. The city grew faster than humans could safely survive, leaving behind a lesson written not in monuments, but in lives stretched thin by progress that asked more than it gave. As awareness of these conditions slowly spread, Berlin's people began to recognize that endurance alone could not sustain the city forever. Conversations about reform surfaced quietly, often in private spaces rather than public ones, because challenging the system openly carried risks few could afford. The pressure of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and exhausting labor made clear that unchecked growth was eroding the very workforce it relied upon. Yet change moved slowly, constrained by economic priorities and a belief that progress justified sacrifice. For many, survival remained the primary concern, leaving little energy to imagine alternatives. The city continued to demand more than it returned, reinforcing a cycle where human limits were tested daily. Looking back, Berlin in 1850 stands as a powerful example of how rapid urban growth can outpace human capacity. The city's growth reshaped lives in ways that were invisible to those celebrating industrial success, but deeply felt by ordinary people. What history often frames as advancement was for many a relentless struggle to keep pace with a world moving too fast. Berlin survived, but its people paid a price that progress rarely records. The city's story reminds us that growth without care does not simply reshape landscapes, it reshapes human habitation itself, revealing that survival in an expanding world requires balance as much as ambition. As the century advanced, the long-term effects of Berlin's rapid growth began to settle into the lives of those who had spent decades under constant strain. Many workers aged quickly, their bodies worn down by labor that never allowed time for recovery, while younger generations entered the same cycle with little expectation of escape. The city's expansion normalized exhaustion, turning it into a shared experience rather than an exception. What once felt temporary became permanent, and people adjusted their expectations accordingly, measuring success not by comfort or security, but by the ability to endure without collapse. Berlin taught its residents to live with instability, shaping a culture where resilience was admired because it was necessary. The human cost remained largely unspoken, absorbed into routine as the city continued to redefine itself through growth. By reflecting on Berlin in 1850, it becomes clear that the city's greatest transformation was not physical, but human. Streets, factories, and buildings told a story of progress, yet the true narrative unfolded within the